Welcome back to part 2. Hopefully you join me on the back of part 1. If not, get over there first. Here we're picking back up with our journey of the Dreamcast, the Neon 250, and why it's such a cherished memory. One of its core pillars was its forward-thinking design, and that certainly included its output methods. As you would have seen from part 1, the image quality here was much better than probably many of you remember, and there's very good reason for that. You see, the Dreamcast was a console of many firsts. One of those was the breadth of display options it could offer, with no modification required and full support from Sega. At the time in the late 90s in America and Japan, the standard was still composite cables, those yellow, red and white phono jacks that most TVs came with. Here in Europe though, we had moved on to the far superior, potentially, SCART connection, which was a French invention, and it roughly translates to Trade Union of Manufacturers of Radio Receiving Devices. Not as catchy as SCART, is it? Now this was also used in America, but it never took off as a standard, such as we saw in main areas of Europe, including the UK. Now on its own, SCART was a cheap, simple and reliable pin-out connector that could scale from the same quality in feed that composite offered, to full, clean, component level quality in full RGB if all pins were tapped. This meant that by looking at an AV's equipment input or output, you did not know what it would or could accept, but the cable itself gave you a visual guide. Quick version here is the more metal pins you see, the better the quality of the output potential. The Dreamcast was the very first console to enable as standard on nearly all titles a 50 or 60 Hz PAL option. Now this resolved one of the biggest issues us PAL and CCAM countries dealt with since gaming's origin, at least when titles were made for NTSC territories as a focus. Not just 16.6% slower frame rates, but also slower game times, meaning animation, music, logic, etc. would all be slower than intended than the target build. Demonstrated here with Expendables running the same track demo at 50 and then 60 Hz, the game grows further and further out of sync. Now in addition, the image quality would be reduced as the never the same colour twice Japan or American display not only had worse colour carrier quality than PAL, it also had a lower resolution, mostly 240 height versus 288 of the PAL feed for the 8 and 16-bit era, and in the 480i world this meant 576i for PAL. A sizable increase in pixels back then, but many titles wasted this extra space and just squashed the game into a smaller window, and many ruined the aspect ratio of the pixel art design, and even 3D games on the PlayStation 1, the Saturn, etc. were all affected. With the Dreamcast, all of this could be resolved with the developer adding little to no work with a simple hardware level toggle that could be enabled in the menu, meaning you could get the bigger screen and better quality of PAL, but also the same speed and rates of our NTSC cousins in this PAL 60 option, the best of both. Which was bliss and a real win for the Dreamcast at the time, as other consoles like the Xbox original, the GameCube and the PS2 all followed suit. And none of those had all the graphical options of output that the Dreamcast has. Now previous consoles sometimes had this option on a title by title basis, but the Dreamcast made it a standard. Depending on which cable you purchased and the associated display you owned, 50-60 Hz is standard, SCART, composite, RGB and even full PCD sub VGA. This is what makes the Dreamcast a gorgeous looking display even now, as many older LED panels still have a VGA port on them, and you can just as easily plug it in between a VGA to DVI connector as well. This was the premium display option, unlocking vastly superior screen quality over all other options and really being as good as modern HDMI mod the Dreamcast can now be fitted with. But all you need is that Sega sold compatible VGA cable, or at least one compatible with it. This meant that even with RGB SCART, many titles would still output 640x480i, which is really 640x240. On a then common CRT, this would still be excellent image quality, as you can see on screen now, and certainly not the horrendous shearing pain on your retinas this becomes on today's modern hold and display panels. Without any form of correcting interpretation and filtering to fix this, you end up with a dithered striped mess, as you see here. But you can reduce this, as most modern TVs even see clean 240p feed as interlaced and thus stretch and blur it in exactly the same way. But on a CRT, this will still look much better than even the cleaned up 480i feed you see here, offering a sharper and deeper image where those artifacts are all factored into the phosphor display method and still look impressively sharp. All of which I've covered in my previous videos on CRT and LCDs. Not just around this display type, but also the ruination of the display itself in terms of the aspect ratio, the way pixels and the phosphor display was designed around the art and the overall delivery of the titles. It was intrinsic in its whole design. But before I disappear up my own backside, a full 480p output looks vastly superior on a PC CRT monitor, but the biggest gains come from running it all on a modern LCD, and it now looks like a retro PC game running on a modern emulator. This is because using the VGA cable, the Dreamcast CPU can check which pins are enabled within the motherboard connector. This then updates a display register and informs the Holly GPU which output mode to use. A few titles do not support this full 720 by 480p display output that it offers as a locked standard here when you use the cable, but there are a few that don't. Also, some titles will not allow you to swap saves if played with VGA or SCART, again due to those data changes made to the save at the time and the associated hardware registers that I'm sure would be affected. It is a minor impact though, with the payback being that all these titles run in the very best possible image quality and make the Dreamcast a console that supersedes many later release console displays, with many offering far worse IQ without community made hardware modifications. And as a result, you have been watching some comparisons of the increase this choice makes. Expendable here is at much worse state with SCART RGB, 50Hz, so 25 FPS, and 640 by 480i output. Well, actually 576p, like I say in the UK, that stretched screen, it actually is just squashed back into a bigger display, so it just actually exacerbates the problem. But overall, we get a smaller screen, 50% less pixels, slower gameplay, and frame rates, much lower image quality and clarity. And on the left, you can see the exact same console. We now get that beautiful 720 480 output. And remember, the workable image in here is still only 640 by 480. Far higher color quality and pixel clarity, 60Hz output as standard, so 30 FPS here, and the correct engine cycle timing and associated logic that runs alongside it. All of this in beautiful progressive screens. The result is like a remaster, with texture details being much cleaner and better defined, sharper geometry, visible improvements being obvious in texture filtering used from bi or trilinear, and as such it means this video and comparisons stacks the Dreamcast up to the very best of the PCs at the time. And it also had another boost that even the mighty Voodoo 2 and 3 could not equal. Kind of. Color depth. You see, one big area of PC improvement around 97 onwards was the shift away from 16-bit color depths, 8-bit textures, and even 16-bit depth or Z buffers. It did continue for a good few years after this though. The Dreamcast and Neon 250 both offered superior color reproduction, with choices for 16 or 32-bit color. 24-bit in the Dreamcast case to again reduce bandwidth, but this was close to the PC's best had to offer at the time at 32-bit. Other cards at the time had also started to offer this, such as Nvidia, ATI, Matrox, all offering greater than 16-bit choices, which the Voodoo 2 and 3 was limited to, along with resolution. Although it did actually dither this down from the internal frame buffer's 24-bit level, meaning some of the marketing and sales pitches back then were not an honest representation of what you actually saw on screen. It was not exactly 16 versus 16 directly, and this was compounded by the fact that the Voodoo 2 could not display 2D desktops itself. You had to run it through a second 2D card for the output. This is one of the big reasons why the Voodoo Banshee even existed at all. The long story short, the Voodoo 2 was still the best performing card in almost all titles in '98 and still into most of '99, no matter which you had. It was helped by its twin texel pipeline similar to the TNT2, but it still was limited, unable to break free from 1024x768 and a 16-bit color depth. Nvidia and the TNT2 played on the fact that it could target 1024x768 at 32-bit color depth, which the Neon 250 could also do in 98 here, meaning it was playing with the big boys and outperforming even the Voodoo 2 and later Voodoo 3 in 98. The Dreamcast and Neon 250 also supported bump mapping, which the TNT2 did, which later evolved into what we know now as normal maps. It could have 32-bit color and 32-bit depth buffer due to its TBDR rasterization rendering method, and this had a smaller impact on performance than other cards. But let's be honest here. Even in early 2000s, if you were running 800x600 at 32-bit depth or higher, effectively, your frame rates were often sub 30 FPS, or at least sub 60 most of the time. But choice is choice, and that is the best part. The Neon 250 then really offered a considerable level of quality and choice for the time, and at £130 new in 99 it was a good deal, but had it launched in 98 at that price, I think it would have changed the PC market. Maybe not in the long run, but it would have been a disruptor for sure. The Dreamcast then took most of the benefits this card offered and enabled it to deliver the very best of the PC at the time, and in some cases even better it quite considerably, such as in our next title.
No! Please!
I didn't recognize these flayed racks of flesh. Their scent was vampiric. They gnawed upon their victim's carcass like dogs.
Soul Reaver is an absolute classic for a great many reasons, one of my personal favourites. And with all the talk in 1998 and 99 from what the Dreamcast could offer, with many PC developers and companies getting a little twitchy and defensive at the times, the game results I've covered so far may leave a bad taste in your mouth, but I picked these for a reason, as they represent the worst case scenario and also the reality of what is as true now as then. Not all games, ports and developments are created equal. The baseline for a team's aims will never be a fixed target, and as such we have quick wins for a tight and consistent launch release with incoming, or in Half-Life's case, a quick port to capitalise on the success and market a brand new and burning hot property brings, such as Half-Life was back then. But it can also be a time to shine, and a team that many now know as the premium porting house of PC to console and back again in Nix's, they had their early days to shine and kick off the high technical skills they offered in the market early in the Dreamcast life. Without a doubt, the premium version that the Dreamcast offered in Soul Reaver. Nix's went above the Call of Duty with improved Raziel models, texture improvements, and most obvious of all, frame rates being double over the PS1 and even the PC release to 60 FPS. This was a shining example of just what the Dreamcast could offer, and Nix's made very short work of a clearing the pipes port, so to speak, to establish a solid basis for the engine port to a native Dreamcast sequel. This port was a rush one, done in around 9 months or so, and limited the amount of improvements they could make, but it still stood tall at the time, and it was the very first place I actually played this magnificent title in 2000. This work was going to be the basis for the then shown and targeted release of the Soul Reaver sequel. As it stands, we only ever have this port to demonstrate the potential both the Dreamcast and the sequel had, but the results remain mouth-watering. With this release though, we see the team offer a clean PC equaling 640x480 output, but no longer locked at 30 FPS, and instead it runs at 60 or 50 if you choose the PAL SCART option. And Nix's again remained true to form by utilising the SCART as best they could, giving you a full 576i output here in PAL land, which is far superior to many other titles using SCART. It's not as good as the 480p output of VGA, but at least fits the PAL screens correctly and looks better for it. On top of this, Raziel can see clear upgrades on his model with higher poly counts, improved textures and other fixes to the world textures on seams and warping, significantly in the case of the PS1's release with its affine texture warping issues, something I covered in detail back in my Wipeout retrospective over 5 years ago now.
I know you, Raziel. You are worthy.
What madness is this? What pitiful form is this that I have come to inhabit?
It is this soul that animates the corpse you lived in. And that, Raziel, is the demise of Nosgoth. There is no balance. The souls of the dead remain trapped. I cannot spin them in the wheel of fate. They cannot complete their destinies. Redeem yourself. Or if you prefer, avenge yourself.
Now aside this, the only big increase is within that performance level, feeling far smoother and more responsive now in all of Raziel's abilities. It made a big impression on the market, and I'm certain helped shift many Dreamcasts from PS1 and PC players. It also gives us a good example of improvements from prior generations to new ones. Take the PlayStation 1 as an example with the same title this was designed for. That bit dithering, the low colour bit depth of the actual frame buffer stands out, but so does the texture filtering, the lack thereof, at times looking sharper than even the PC here. And this means that texture compression and filtering all had an impact on some of the visual quality, and with titles such as Soul Reaver with very single texture maps, this can stand out at certain points as you see here, with definitely the PC having the slight edge even against the Dreamcast, and that's because the Dreamcast was very memory constrained, a common issue with consoles even today. So even here with comparisons as tight as this, you can see there are subtle improvements on the PC's best to Dreamcast, but it's so minor that in play it just simply doesn't stand out. And this means by using that compression technique, they got the best bang out of their 8 megabytes of VRAM.
Ah, these creatures.
Do you not recognize them? They are the children of your brother, Duma.
That's impossible. These foul, scuttling beasts could not be kin of our high blood.
Do you suppose that time stood still for you, Raziel? Much has changed since you passed from the world of men.
I knew my opponent's weaknesses, having suffered them myself. Physical wounds are fleeting. Vampire's immortal flesh begins to close as soon as it is cleaved. Vampires need only fear those wounds that impale or inflame. Water scorches like acid, and fledglings are devastated by sunlight's touch. I would have to modify my tactics to suit my foes.
Now, the Dreamcast did improve in other areas though. The hardware-based depth fog combined with a slightly further draw distance than PC meant that vertices drawing in and out within the camera frustum were almost eliminated. Looking very subtle now, with the effect being far more prominent on PS1 and PC. Raziel's improved model is also a great choice as he tends to be on screen quite often, but the main draw is that 60 FPS frame rate which the PC could only achieve years later thanks to a community mod, and even then you would need a GPU in excess of the Neon 250 to outperform the Dreamcast. That said, it's not a locked 60 FPS throughout. Most action sections are pretty good, but once you get multiple characters, skinning, alpha, light maps, particles, etc, it can have some small skips into 33 milliseconds, meaning a 55-ish level of performance. It can dip in other areas though, with the Crystal Dynamics game engine being a revolution on PlayStation 1 with its CD-ROM streaming technology, removing loading screens as you played. On the Dreamcast, mimicked here with my PC install from CD-ROM also, the game is constantly streaming in new sectors of data within a grid whilst removing ones behind. Again, a technique designed around maximising memory. This juggling of data can cause some skips and even 30 FPS sections as data is pushed, pulled and manipulated. The PC version can see slightly less skips and slowdown when fully installed to hard drive, but the bad frame pacing shown here remains, as does a 30 FPS cap from that DirectX driven renderer. Even overriding VSync in the driver panel doesn't remove this. The net result is we can see the Dreamcast also dips into short stints of 30 FPS when larger sections are loading in. The other areas revolve around warping between worlds, reaving a victim's souls after reaping them, and these also cause similar 30 FPS sections, albeit briefly. Now to my knowledge all Dreamcast games were double buffered, so this makes sense, and I suspect it may be related to core engine code, CPU particle systems, animation, data, etc. The main reason though will be the limited time and budget Nixxes had to port this title to a brand new system. As mentioned, these time constraints on the port gave us a double-edged sword. one that Nix's excelled with, teasing a glimpse of the potential the Dreamcast and themselves had. Also, what could have been from that longer, fuller sequel that would have benefited greatly from this port, and how much they could have raised the bar from this excellent result. The PC's only advantage is being able to run the game at higher resolutions and bit depth than the Dreamcast, but that's not that impactful over all the benefits the Dreamcast offers, making this a clear win for the Dreamcast over the PC's best, as it sinks its teeth into that PC lead.
And yet, I had only just emerged. In the instant between my execution and resurrection, centuries had apparently passed.
This world is wrecked with cataclysms. The earth strains to shrug off the pestilence of Cain's parasitic empire. The fate of this world was preordained in an instant by a solitary man. Unwilling to martyr himself to restore Nosgoth's balance, Cain condemned the world to the decay you see. In that moment, the unraveling began. Now it is nearly played out. Nosgoth teeters on the brink of collapse. Its fragile balance cannot hold.
It's no great revelation to state that two core pillars for Sega in the Dreamcast design plan were to dominate the console space with forward-looking technology, but also embrace its arcade dominance, and they achieved both of those goals in excess, being the first console to ship with a built-in modem, offering upgrades with a full RJ45 LAN connection, a multitude of inputs and peripherals, VMU mini console, keyboard and mouse support from the start, fishing rods, arcade fighting sticks, and light guns. One of the key attractions for arcades since the 60s and home gaming since the 80s. House of the Dead 2 was a blast on the Naomi Arcade board, and a perfect home conversion was now a reality thanks to the symbiotic design brief they both shared. For all intents and purposes they are exactly the same. The Naomi taps into the higher VRAM allocation the Holly GPU can support, 16 rather than 8 megabytes of the Dreamcast. This increase of memory carried over to the system RAM, which was also doubled to 32 megabytes, and the sound RAM, which was quadrupled to 8 rather than 2. And this shows something that is as true then as now. Memory is expensive, and it's somewhere where consoles normally make sacrifices. Almost all commercial devices are a balance of cost versus power. Choices are made to maximise this, and with the Dreamcast that 8 megabytes of VRAM was excellent at the time, but certainly not abundant. As such, this needed to be maximised, and compression is always the fastest answer. In the Dreamcast, this was VQ, or vector quantization, a lossy compression technique that offered up to 7 times compression on large textures. This was a vital aspect for the Dreamcast, as in the console space you can use a proprietary solution like this and provide the compression tool up front within your SDK, which Sega did. The developers then take their authored texture assets and compress them down into the VQ format and feed them into the data pool ahead of runtime decompression by the GPU. The Dreamcast also supported uncompressed textures, but VQ was the best compromise. As a short description, VQ is similar to CLUTs, or colour lookup tables, that we know from the 8 and 16-bit era, with an index built on textures to condense each 4x4 texel grid element into a 2x2 texture array, and using this index to look up each 4 texels of data, and then revert to the codebook allocated to this, and then it rolls this out in a reverse end sequence at decompression time within the texture memory. The index and codebook had to be contiguous in VRAM, but the benefits beyond a 32x32 texture were significant and required. Taking a common 256x256 texture size with a non-twiddled texture format, uncompressed effectively, this would take around 132,000 bytes or 128 kilobytes in VRAM. With VQ compression, it only occupies 18 kilobytes, saving on VRAM and bandwidth, or put another way, between 4 to 7 times increase in VRAM and bandwidth. Using my expendable Dreamcast disc and PC game here, I've extracted the textures and converted them from the base .pvr format the Dreamcast uses to PNG. And you can see the reduction in both resolution and color clarity. It's noticeable obviously when zoomed in, but at standard viewing distance the texture is designed for, the delta is much smaller to invisible. Besides some minor exceptions, the cost outweighs the negatives. And this is what I always refer to in my modern day analysis when I say smarter pixels over simply more of them. This also aided the Naomi board, getting more from its bigger pool of RAM. And one benefit of the VQ compression is, by its technique, bilinear filtering is practically free, and it's why it was the baseline for so many Dreamcast titles. Although it did also support trilinear and anisotropic filtering, although that had a huge cost on performance, with good old-fashioned point sampling also being possible and used quite often. Looking at the PC versus Dreamcast here in side by side, you'd be hard pressed to see any deficit. But the console benefits from a huge cost reduction of 4 times less VRAM than the Neon 250 with practically identical quality. A shining example of console optimization and cost versus power in action. Our next game helps highlight the console advantage very well, with Shiny Entertainment's Mad as a Box of Frogs original MDK in '97 from the legend Dave Perry, Nick Rudy and other team members that brought us the groundbreaking Aladdin on Sega's Mega Drive and equally bonkers Earthworm Jim, delivered a wacky, witty and action-packed third-person adventure cum shooter that pushed technology of the time on PC and console in the PlayStation 1 port. With the Murder Death Kill 2 sequel, the development jumped to BioWare and the Dreamcast was its launch platform, very much in keeping with its PC roots, with palletized textures being of high use and focus in many games designed at the time, including the MDK original. This worked well for the Dreamcast VQ methods we just covered, but the bi or trilinear filtered impact over point sampled high resolution textures could affect certain areas. The technology was changed though from the original shiny source code of MDK, now using BioWare's own Omen engine, to craft this equally crazy with a capital K sequel of Kurt and Crew, of which the other two are now playable. It remained true to those aims and art though, with the signature high level zoom being front and centre.
9 5 3 Good gravy! That's Edmonton! Well, Kurt, I hope you're up to saving the world one more time, yes?
You sure are quick to send me down.
One of the biggest visual differences is the lack of light sources and dynamic shadow casting on PC. You can see here on the left those moving casting light sources from characters on Dreamcast. They're missing on the PC, as is that reduction in texture filtering. Here again, that strobing light source to shadow and shade, the lights bouncing off the backs of his legs, the shadow casting light source from outside, all missing on PC. That dithering striped and the blockiness of the texture backgrounds here also stand out on PC, but again, I suspect some of this is driver issues from the TNT2 OpenGL driver. And then a negative for the Dreamcast is these 16-bit heavily banded textures do stand out at times, looking far worse than they do against the best on PC. And these parts can bounce back and forth during the title, PC to console, console to PC, whichever is better. But what does stand out the most is the lack of dynamic lighting and shadow that really is much better on the Dreamcast. The heavily used dynamic shadow casting light sources in the title cause those Kurt shadows to dance underneath his feet as he runs underneath, and they're completely static on PC, having no movement at all and just being fixed underneath Kurt's character like a 2D sprite of the old school 2D titles. And again, the lighting in certain sections is much flatter and very uniform on PC, with no dynamic lights, no shade into the background, making levels like this look very flat without that contrast that the Dreamcast has, and that darker shade and light contrast just improves materials and the quality of the world, as does it fixing the sorting transparency issues present here on PC. Now, like the original, 30 FPS was the target on Dreamcast, and on PC this could go higher if you had the hardware. But even on a TNT2 M64 card here at 32-bit color depth, you are often just 30 FPS, and sometimes below that in firefights or sniper shots. Dropping down to 16-bit color does help, specifically around the bandwidth limitations of this card, with the game now being able to hit the 80s and down to the 40s. It flip-flops between the two, a common case in these burgeoning days of 3D PC gaming, and as such, the capped 30 FPS on Dreamcast was likely what the majority of us PC gamers played it at, even in the early 2000s. The GPU required to cap at 60 or higher resolutions in depth was just not a reality then. You can see in comparison to PC that the Dreamcast texture compression can cause some reduction in fidelity, as can that 24-bit color depth over 32, but again, the level of scrutinizing required to spot this would be very hard and almost invisible on the CRT displays of the time that still dominated PC and consoles alike. Unlike the first MDK though, this version never shipped with an SGL API driver, and as such, the Neon 250 is losing a great deal to the Dreamcast, which would have been written to the OpenGL equivalent for that console, which certainly helps. Again, a 640x480p output with trilinear filtering and the same vibrant colour and creature design makes it a cracker to look at, and it stacks up well to the very best on PC, even the TNT2 version here. The reason I say that is the Neon 250 is severely hindered in this title due to the age of the release, the lack of direct OpenGL support within its driver, which I covered in video 1, and thus the mini patch still leaves this not using the hardware well at all, reinforcing my points on just how important APIs are. This may even be a direct 3D fallback version. It underutilizes the machine with huge CPU cost to run this, which I covered in part 1, and the performance is, well, look at the benchmark. 3 FPS at 640x480 16-bit color with bilinear filtering is not a great showing at all. And really, to be able to play the game, you have to drop it down to 320x200, which gives us around 5 to 10 FPS, or a third at best of the Dreamcast performance. At over 2 times the resolution, visual settings and colour depth, the Dreamcast really stands out as a stark difference between the console and PC versions here. It's similar to the rushed Windows CE Half-Life port, yet worse, and obviously in reverse, in the DC's favour as the lead console version. That said, it is not a poor PC port from console, as the PC release was mere weeks later and certainly front and centre in the team's focus and development. Dreamcast release stands shoulder to shoulder with the PC's best, and in some cases betters it in terms of the lighting, shadow and those transparencies. But there are some sacrifices in terms of that VQ compression that can crop up from time to time, and if you had the very best GPU and CPU of the time, then you could run this at high resolutions and frame rates. The increase over the Neon 250 does represent a clean example that the bespoke architecture of the Dreamcast and Neon 250 did have instances, certainly in those CPU demands, that could impact both when the incorrect development choices and APIs were used, with the results drastically affecting the host platform's potential and certainly your enjoyment. It comes as no shock the Dreamcast again takes this title for another win, drawing the PC and Dreamcast neck and neck now from this round, and that is true even if you use a 2000 spec Duron CPU. Although that does reduce the performance deficit a little, the impact is very minor to say the least. You could say the Dreamcast is absolutely killing it. Sorry. must be noted how enjoyable the old installers used to be on PC. I do miss these days of getting your CD-ROM, sticking it in, installing it, and looking at all the demos and options, and the care and attention was done to the install menu. Even the lovely little reference here to Charlie's Angels from MDK2. It's a great treat. You look at demos, videos, and all those things are kind of lost to time now, and it is a look back where there's so much passion in games from the beginning to end that comes across in every single aspect, and MDK2 is a good example of that, remaining true to the original kooky crazy MDK from the passionate team at Shiny Entertainment, but managing to improve it in certain areas, but certainly not a better game, but one that really felt true to the origins of the title. It is a good look back at these early mid-90s titles that I do enjoy every time I pull them out. And to reinforce the completeness of the analysis I've just covered on the older PC titles, even running the same disc on a modern PC, those same lighting and shadow issues are all missing here on our RX 6800, which I'm pretty sure you'll agree would not struggle running this title in any way, shape or form.
If we can, but for now it's up to you! Jinkies, I'm so proud!
That's another chapter drawing to a close, but don't worry, there is more to come on this Dreamcast versus Neon 250 versus all things back in the 90s. Please check back very soon for my third and final section, which will get more into the games, the comparisons, and less about the hardware, the construction and the software, which I think I've now covered to death in the last two videos, to give you an holistic view of how all these things shake out and why you will see some of the results that are yet to come. I'd like to thank all my patrons for supporting me on here. You can see them all in the video and the screen at the moment, and this would not be possible without those people supporting me. So if you are a patron, I hope you enjoyed this and more videos to come, and other ones that are up. If you're not and you are seeing this on public view now, remember you can jump online and look at the extended third part, the first part, and other exclusive content on Patreon just by supporting me for a couple of pounds or dollars a month. If you can, it really helps support the channel, improve the quality of the work, and hopefully give you more of what you want. Anyway, I'm out for now, but I'll be back very soon with more Dreamcast action. I'll catch you on the next one.